these generals that were part of what I call the Greater Israel Lobby understood that there is now an historical opportunity in their discourse, in their language, to complete the job of 1948. And in 1963, under the guidance of the new prime minister, who replaced David Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol, they began planning the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Since 1963, they convened a group of legal experts, military rulers who were ruling the Arab parts within Israel, of course, military generals, academics, and so on, in order to be ready for how to administer and manage the occupation of two areas which they knew were, first of all, highly populated with Palestinians, densely populated with Palestinians, and were densely populated with Palestinian refugees who were already expelled in 1948. So they felt that they need to be strategically prepared for such an event. Why is this so important? Because the narrative that even some friends of Palestine are providing us about 1967 is that the Arab world wanted to destroy Israel, and that's why Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But the truth is that the 1967 events provided an opportunity for the Greater Israel Lobby to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And they always regarded the West Bank as the heart of the Jewish nation, and strategically they thought that the Jordan River was also important, although those of you who have seen the Jordan River would know that it's quite ridiculous to think that it can stop even a soldier, let alone a tank, to cross over. But it sold well in the world that Israel needed a natural barrier on the West Bank. And these preparations are important because it shows that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that was not completed in terms of population, because half of the Palestinian population still remained in historical Palestine, and was not completed in terms of space, because 78%, only 78% of Palestine became Israel, that the strategy of Israel was now very clearly, and this was a consensual strategy of Israel, that let's take the space, despite of Ben-Gurion's warning, let's take the space and we will know what to do with the millions of Palestinians that come with it. And I'll come, in a moment, I will come to their decision, what to do with the Palestinians. But it was very clear that from 63 to 1967, Israel prepared the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, believing that without these territories, the Zionist project would not be complete and would not be able to survive. After the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Israeli government, and this was the 13th Israeli government, which was the most consensual government in Israel history. Almost every political party was represented in that government, the 13th government of Israel, including the Orthodox anti-Zionist parties in Israeli politics. Almost everyone was there. And that government took 3 or 4 decisions with regard to the fate of the territories and the people living in them, that is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are very crucial to what happened later on and what happens today. The first decision, and this was incredible because this decision was actually publicized by the government of Israel. And yet, if you go to the State Department website today or the website of the EU, you will see that that very famous Israeli decision in 1967 is not mentioned at all. And what was that decision? That Israel would never give up the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is a different story. We'll come back to this. But Israel could never give up the West Bank, because the West Bank is the heart, as they would call it, the heart of the land of Israel. It's the heart of the land of Israel. And yes, Israel can negotiate the other territories it occupied in 1967, like the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, but not the West Bank. And this was a consensus between the left and the right. And that's the only decision of the secret decisions, that they actually convened a press conference to announce it, not for the world, for domestic consumption. As I said today to the students in Ann Arbor, they always think that when they announce something in Hebrew, nobody understands it. So it was not published as in English, but it was. You can look at the Israeli newspapers from the 10th and 11th of June. The prime minister has a press conference and he says, we will negotiate about the Sinai, we will negotiate about the Golan Heights, but not about the West Bank. He says this always was part of the Jewish nation, and so on. The second decision, and these were decisions we found in the archives and they didn't publicize at the time. The second decision was, if this is the case, what should we do with the people there? What should be the fate of the people if Israel is going to incorporate the West Bank, and also, at that time, they decided also to incorporate the Gaza Strip? What should be the decision? So one a clear idea that was seriously deliberated was to do what they did in 1948, that is, to ethnically cleanse the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And there they decided eventually that this was a different historical moment compared to 1948. The war, as you know, was very short, 6 days. There was already television. One expert told them, you know, these are refugees. I'm not sure we will be able that easily to expel refugees for the second time. So for all kinds of consideration, they decided not to expel the people of the West Bank, although one should say Israel expelled 300,000 Palestinians from the West Bank in June 1967. But compared to 1948, it was a relatively small number. So the second plan was, at least let us expel the people of Gaza. And this took a more serious shape. And they were trying to see whether there are people in Gaza who are willing to move to the West Bank or willing to move to Egypt. Then they also tried to bribe people, to give them money to move to Venezuela. This was a different Venezuela in those days. And all these programs did not work. These programs did not work. So they understood that their decision to keep the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with the people in it creates a problem for them because they are so obsessed with demography. And the question was, what would be the status of the people who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? And the man who led the strategic decision on how the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip will be treated from 1967 until today was the Israeli Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan. And he coined a term. He said, the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would be citizenless citizens. Citizens without citizenship. And even someone like Menachem Begin, who was not a great humanist, he said, this is not humane. We have the stenograms we have the records from the government, so we know what each one of them said. And he said, this is, you know, he felt uncomfortable with this. And Dayan said to him, don't worry, people can live with this for a very long time. And he said, for how long? And Dayan said, well, at least for 50 years. We won't have to worry about this. The next decision was, if you don't get out of the territories, and you don't expel the people, and you're not going to give them citizenship, although you're going to rule them. You're going to rule them without giving them citizenship. The big question was, how would our great ally, the United States, deal with our decisions. And then and there was born the so-called peace process, which was not the brainchild of the Minister of Defense, but was the brainchild of the Foreign Minister, Abba Eban. He clearly lines up, outlines something that we know in hindsight as historians, but we can see how inventive, in a very negative way, he was. He said there's a difference between peace and a peace process. And I think you know, the rest is history, as they say. And he said, as long as we are committed to the process, it doesn't mean we are committed to peace. And this is what we should tell the Americans. And not only that, he said, let them lead the process. And the Americans fell for it. As, of course, Dr. Nu said, it also fulfilled their own interest and so on. Of course, the last thing the Americans wanted was for anyone else but the Americans to be involved in the so-called peace process. So you had these actually kind of 4 decisions, very strategic decisions, which you'd notice immediately. One thing is not there, of course, is asking the Palestinians at all to take part in the conversation about their future. But what is incredible about these strategic decisions, that they fed all the Israeli policies from 1967 until today. One of the greatest Israeli success that I'm glad to say can be now regarded as failure, but for many years was a success, was to create the charade as if there is a genuine discussion within the Israeli society, that is the Israeli Jewish society, between a peace camp and what they call the national camp. The peace camp is the one that supports withdrawing from the occupied territories, and the national camp is the one who believes in the greater Israel. Many people fell for it. Quite a lot of Palestinians fell for it, unfortunately. That there was really in the Israeli society a group of people whose support for the withdrawal from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was an indication for the willing to reconcile, to share the land in an equal way with the Palestinians. This was a charade because both camps were totally in agreement with the strategic decisions of the 13th government of Israel. What they debated was not peace or war. They debated about the tactics. The so-called peace camp that eventually produced the bitter harvest of Oslo believed that an indirect rule of Israel is much better than direct rule. And if you can call the indirect rule a two-state solution, it's even better. And if you can have a Palestinian partner who is willing to help with the indirect rule, it's even better. And then, as Abba Eban said, you have a process that will never end and doesn't lead to anywhere. But you have a process because there's so much to talk about. I cannot imagine to begin and assess the number of academics and journalists who made a life career out of the so-called peace process. In this country alone, there are institutes and think tanks and academic departments and famous journalists whom I will not mention by name, but they're very known to you, who made a life career from the so-called peace process, which was a charade which allowed Israel not only to avoid the withdrawal, but to implement the real plan that they had from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And that plan was debated, and we can see this kind of debate today in a much clearer way. There was one group of Israeli leaders and strategists who said the best way to control the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is to Judaize part of the West Bank, part of the Gaza Strip, and enclave the Palestinians in the densely populated area, so you have a Palestinian West Bank and a Jewish West Bank. And you have a Palestinian Gaza, and a Jewish Gaza. And in that way, especially the Supreme Court of Israel, the liberal Jews in Israel, the intellectuals who had this, probably some genuine remorse about some of the things that were happening, would feel better. Namely, we didn't take the land of the Palestinians. We only Judaized land that was mawat, yani, according to the Ottoman law, was not cultivated. It was not cultivated because the Palestinians were kicked out of the land. That's why it was not cultivated. So it was for domestic consumption of the more sensitive, if you want, sections of the Israeli society, the academia, the media, and especially the supporters among the liberal Jews in America and liberal people around the world. It seemed as a reasonable, almost humane, enlightened approach to something that Israel claimed was not its making because they didn't start the 67 war. What could they do? So they had to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but they're trying to give autonomy. They're trying to give a way of life to the people there. But of course, where the Palestinians do not live exactly is a land the Palestinians don't need. The Palestinians don't need spaces. They don't need green lungs. They don't need parks. They're very happy to live in a ghettoized community. This was the liberal perspective. This was the liberal perspective. And this is because the Labour Party that controlled Israel until 1977 began very heavy colonization. The first Israeli Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank were built by the Israeli left, the same left that committed the ethnic cleansing in 1948. What they didn't take into account, and this is something they didn't plan, that when you start opening this Pandora box of settler colonialism, you cannot always control your own demons. And what happened was that a messianic movement that regarded the 67 war in a very different way than the pragmatic Zionists. The pragmatic Zionists had this stages plan. You know, eventually we will take all over Palestine, and we have all kinds of ideas of how to control the Palestinians. But it's all pragmatic, it's all realistic. They didn't take into account that there was a messianic group that said, no, wait a minute, what happened in 67 is God's will. It's a message from God. So we're not just going to settle in empty, which was not empty anyway, but in empty land in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank. We're going to settle everywhere, including in the heart of the Palestinian cities. Because our map is not a strategic map of settlement. Our map is the biblical map. So wherever we think there is a biblical place, the Jews should not only settle there, they should displace the Palestinian and replace them. And one of the most horrific examples for that kind of ideology was implemented, as you know, in the city of Halil, in Hebron, in East Jerusalem, in parts of Nablus. Luckily, it's not that luckily, because Jenin and Tulkarem are also suffering, but they don't seem to appear on the biblical map of the Messianic Jews. But it doesn't matter, because in the end of the day, if both movements of colonization, the practical one and the biblical one, collide, there's not much space for anyone to live in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip. If you look more carefully in those decisions and think, how did they translate these decisions into reality in the last 56 years, you understand that both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were run as two mega prisons. In fact, the whole language that the Israeli strategists were using, is the language of prison. It's a language of prison. And they developed kind of two models of prisons for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There was, if you want, the open prison. The open prison is if the inmates are collaborating, cooperating, or at least not resisting, they can have certain autonomy in running the prison. They will still be in the prison, and they will still have to accept Jewish colonization and expropriation of land. But if they, quote unquote, behave well, this is a way of life that surely they would appreciate as a blessing, or as the Israelis called it, as an enlightened occupation. If they resist, they will be punished with the second model, the maximum security prison, which will include collective punishment for everyone. And because the Palestinians resisted, they resisted in Gaza in 68 to 69. They resisted in 76 through the municipal elections in the West Bank. They resisted in the first Intifada. They resisted in the second Intifada. The Israeli reaction was, okay, we offered you an open prison, but you misbehaved, and that's why you'll get the maximum security model. What was so unique about the Gaza Strip was that while, unfortunately, one should say, the Israelis eventually were able to pacify, to domicile, if you want, the West Bank after the second Intifada by creating the best ever version they had of the open prison through the Palestinian Authority, through what is called the Quartet, the EU, Russia, the United States, and so on, namely international immunity for that kind of, and call it, Dr. has mentioned before me, President George Bush Jr., and of course, incorporating all these leaders from the West to give their blessing to the open prison that was created, not in Oslo. The one that was created after the second Intifada is far more important than Oslo. The kind of, the agreement that were never publicized. I mean, the agreement of Oslo were publicized. The agreement between Israel and the PA after the end of the second Intifada, which came to an end more or less in April 2002, were never publicized. And these are far more important than the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement was already dead in 2002. It didn't matter at all what was written there, and it was a terrible document by itself, but it was not the relevant document. The relevant documents are those of April 2002. And that was working for a while. That was working for a while. But it didn't work in the Gaza Strip. The people of Gaza, maybe because 70% of them are refugees, maybe because of a certain history and resilience, or whatever reasons, the Israelis were unable themselves to impose the open prison model on Gaza, and even the maximum security model, namely the collective punishment, did not break the resistance of the people of Gaza. And then they, as you know, they created a third model, which is not even a prison. This is the ghetto, which they built in 2007. The siege, the blockade, collective punishment, which is far worse than any kind of collective punishment they ever did before. And now we have a fourth model, the model of genocide, because everything else is not working. And this is part of the DNA of the Israeli strategic thinking. You have to understand this. They have this kind of gradual thinking of, they try something, it doesn't work, they upgrade the brutality, they upgrade the methodology, and they do something worse because they cannot overcome the resistance and the resilience of the Palestinian people.